She was supposed to say, "I do," to the man she loved, but instead, armed men stormed her wedding and dragged her away screaming. And the worst part? Her fiancé just stood there and watched. Because he's the one who sold her. Literally sold her to a Korean crime lord to pay off his debts. And now Chioma's entire life belongs to a man she's never met, all because of a blood oath her father made before he died. This is the story of how a kidnapped bride became the most powerful woman in Seoul's underground, and how she fell in love with the monster who stole her life. Before we dive in, beautiful people, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe. It's the best way you can support us as we continue delivering captivating stories that'll keep you hooked every single day. Chioma Nwosu stood at the altar in her wedding dress, white lace cascading down to the polished marble floor of the cathedral. Her heart was racing, but not from excitement. Something felt wrong. The ceremony should have started 20 minutes ago, but her fiancé Juno kept whispering urgently with the priest, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't read. Fear? Guilt? She tried to catch his eye, to ask him what was happening, but he wouldn't look at her directly. The massive oak doors of the church suddenly exploded inward with a deafening crash that made every guest scream. Men in black suits poured through the entrance like a dark flood, at least 20 of them, moving with military precision. Their faces were expressionless, cold, and they all had visible weapons holstered at their sides. Chioma's bouquet of white roses fell from her trembling hands, petals scattering across the floor like drops of blood. "Juno, what's happening?" Her voice came out as a terrified whisper, but he still wouldn't meet her eyes. A man emerged from the group, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with sharp Korean features and jet black hair swept back from his forehead. His suit was perfectly tailored, expensive, and his presence commanded the entire space. When his cold, dark eyes landed on Chioma, she felt like she'd been turned to ice. "Chioma Nwosu," he said, his Korean accent precise and clipped. "I am Park Miho. You belong to me now." The words didn't make sense. Chioma looked desperately around the church for help. For someone to tell her this was some kind of horrible joke. Her eyes found her mother sitting in the front pew, and what she saw there broke something inside her. Her mother was crying, tears streaming down her face, but she wasn't moving. She wasn't standing up to defend her daughter. She just sat there, her hands covering her mouth, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. "Mama?" Chioma's voice cracked. "Mama, help me?" But her mother looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Next to her, Chioma's uncle sat rigid in his seat, his jaw clenched so tight, she could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. He too made no move to help her. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that Chioma's legs buckled. Park Miho gestured sharply, and 2 of his men moved forward to grab her arms. She fought them, screaming, kicking, her wedding dress tangling around her legs as she struggled.
"No.
Get off me. Juno, please. Someone help me." She twisted back to look at the man she was supposed to marry, the man she'd loved for 3 years, the man who'd promised to cherish and protect her. And finally, he met her gaze. In that moment, she saw the truth written across his face, as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. He had done this. He had arranged this. He had sold her. The men dragged her down the aisle, her screams echoing off the vaulted ceiling, her white dress leaving a trail across the floor. The last thing she saw before they forced her out the door was Juno's face, pale and guilty, but making no move to stop them. The heavy church doors slammed shut behind her, and Chioma's old life ended. She woke up in complete darkness. For a terrifying moment, she thought she'd gone blind. Panic seized her throat as she sat up, her hands frantically feeling around until they touched cold, concrete walls. The space was tiny, windowless, and it smelled like damp earth and fear. Her beautiful wedding dress was torn and filthy now, the ivory lace stained with dirt and God knows what else. She had no idea how long she'd been unconscious or where she was. Her throat was raw from screaming. Her wrists were bruised and bleeding from fighting against whoever had grabbed her. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the blackness, She could make out a thin line of light beneath what must be a door. She crawled toward it, every muscle in her body aching, and began pounding on the metal with her fists. "Let me out! Please! Somebody help me!" Her voice broke and shattered, but she kept screaming until her hands went numb and her voice disappeared completely. Hours passed, or maybe days. She had no way to tell time in the darkness. Finally, the door opened and harsh fluorescent light flooded in, making her eyes burn and water. Park Miho stood in the doorway, with 2 guards flanking him. He looked at her the same way someone might examine a car they were considering purchasing. Cold. Analytical. Detached. "Are you finished making noise?" he asked calmly. Chioma forced herself to stand, swaying slightly, her ruined dress hanging off her shoulders. "What do you want from me? Why am I here?" He stepped into the room, and his men closed the door behind him. "You're here because of a debt. A promise your father made to me before he died. Daniel Nwosu." The mention of her father's name hit her like a physical blow. Her father had died 4 years ago from a sudden heart attack. It had destroyed their family. He'd been a successful businessman, importing electronics and textiles between Nigeria and South Korea. But Chioma had never known the full extent of his business dealings. "My father had nothing to do with people like you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He was an honest man." Park Miho's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Your father was many things, Chioma, but purely honest was not one of them. He made a blood covenant with me 6 years ago. A binding agreement that tied our families together in business. When he died, that agreement didn't die with him. It transferred to his heir. It transferred to you." Chioma shook her head violently, backing up until her shoulders hit the wall. "That's insane. I never agreed to anything. You can't just kidnap me and claim I'm yours because of some deal I knew nothing about." "I can, and I have," he replied simply. "Without my protection, Chioma, you're worth nothing. Worse than nothing. You're a liability that my enemies would love to exploit. Your family knew this. That's why your mother and uncle didn't intervene. That's why Juno sold you to me instead of marrying you and trying to claim your father's assets for himself." The words struck her like bullets. "Sold me? He sold me. 5 million won, and his miserable life. He had gambling debts to very dangerous people, Chioma. I offered him a way out, and he took it without hesitation. 5 million won. Roughly $4,000. That's what her love, her trust, her entire future had been worth to the man who'd promised to spend his life with her. Chioma felt something fundamental break inside her chest, something that would never be whole again. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, and she started laughing. It was a broken, terrible sound that quickly dissolved into sobs. Park Miho watched her cry without moving, without offering any comfort. When her tears finally ran dry, he spoke again, his voice flat and businesslike. "There are rules here, Chioma. You will follow them. You will not attempt to escape. You will not contact anyone from your old life. And when I need you, you will fulfill the role your father promised you would play. In return, I will keep you alive, fed, and protected from those who would use you against me. Do you understand?" She looked up at him through swollen, tear-streaked eyes. "What role? What am I supposed to do?" He turned toward the door. "You'll learn soon enough. Rest now. You have a long road ahead." The days that followed blurred into a haze of grief and fury. Chioma was moved to a room in what she eventually realized was a massive compound on the outskirts of Seoul. The room was luxurious compared to the cell, with a comfortable bed, a private bathroom, and even a small window overlooking a carefully manicured garden. But it was still a prison. The door was locked from the outside. Armed guards stood in the hallway 24 hours a day. Silent staff brought her 3 meals a day, but they wouldn't meet her eyes or answer her questions. At first, she refused to eat, hoping to starve herself into freedom or death, whichever came first. But Park Miho simply had his guards force-feed her, holding her down while they poured broth down her throat. She realized that even this small act of rebellion would be taken from her. On the 6th day, Park Miho came to her room carrying a worn leather journal. He placed it on the bed next to her and stood back, his hands clasped behind his back. "This belonged to your father," he said quietly. "I thought you should read it. Perhaps it will help you understand." Chioma stared at the journal like it might bite her. She recognized it immediately. Her father had carried it everywhere, writing in it during quiet moments. After his death, her mother had told her it was lost. Now she knew that had been another lie in a lifetime of lies. She picked up the journal with shaking hands and opened it to a random page. Her father's familiar handwriting sprawled across the yellowed paper, and as she began to read, the horrifying truth of her situation became crystal clear. Her father hadn't just been a businessman. He'd been a facilitator, moving money and goods between Nigerian suppliers and Korean criminal organizations. He'd made a fortune doing it. But 6 years ago, a deal had gone catastrophically wrong. People had died, including Park Miho's pregnant wife. To prevent an all-out war that would have destroyed both families, her father had made a blood covenant. His heir would serve as a living bond between the organizations, a guarantee of good faith and continued cooperation. Chioma read through the night, her hands trembling, tears blurring the words. Her father had written about his guilt, his fear, his desperate hope that he could somehow break the covenant before it came due. But he died before finding a way out, leaving Chioma to pay the price for his sins. The last entry was dated 3 days before his death. "I have failed my daughter," he'd written. "I have bound her to a fate she doesn't deserve, and I can see no way to free her. Forgive me, Chioma. Forgive me for being weak, greedy, and foolish. Park Miho is a hard man, but he keeps his word. He will protect you even if he cannot love you. It's poor comfort, I know, but it's all I can offer from the grave." When Park Miho returned in the morning, he found Chioma sitting exactly where he'd left her, the journal open in her lap, her eyes hollow and red. "Now you understand," he said quietly. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she truly saw him. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably in his early 30s, with sharp features and a thin scar along his left jaw. His eyes, which she'd thought were dead and cold, actually held a deep, ancient pain that she recognized because she now carried the same weight. "You lost your wife," she said, her voice hoarse. "In my father's deal." He nodded once, barely perceptible. "Her name was Hyojin. She was 7 months pregnant with our daughter." Chioma closed the journal slowly. "Then why are you keeping me alive? Why not just kill me and have your revenge?" Park Miho walked to the window and looked out at the garden. "Because revenge is a fire that consumes everything, including the one who lights it. Your father paid for his mistakes with his life. Whether you believe it or not, his heart attack was too convenient, too perfectly timed to be natural. Someone wanted him dead. But the covenant remains. Without it, without you, every deal your father brokered falls apart. Wars will break out. Territories will be contested. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people will die. You're not just my captive, Chioma. You're the only thing standing between peace and chaos." The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like chains made of lead. "So, I'm supposed to just accept this? Give up my life, my freedom, everything, because my father made a deal with the devil?" He turned back to face her, and something flickered in his expression. "Respect, maybe. No one's asking you to accept it. I'm telling you this is your reality. What you do with that knowledge is your choice. But understand this. Every person in this compound has been given the same order. You are to be protected at all costs. Not because I care about you personally, but because your life is worth more than all of ours combined. That's your father's legacy, and now it's your burden." Weeks passed, and Chioma began to understand the strange world she'd been forced into. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was also treated with a deference that confused her. The guards bowed when she passed. The staff addressed her respectfully. When she demanded books, they appeared within hours. When she asked for Nigerian food instead of Korean meals, her wishes were granted. She realized slowly that she had power here, even if it was power she'd never wanted. Park Miho came to her room every few days, always bringing documents that needed her attention. She was expected to sign contracts, approve deals, lend her name and her father's legacy to business transactions she barely understood. At first, she refused everything. But Park Miho never forced her. He simply explained the consequences. If she didn't sign this contract, a shipment of medical supplies wouldn't reach a hospital in Lagos. If she didn't approve this deal, a Nigerian community in Busan would lose their protection and face deportation. He made it clear that her choices had real consequences for real people. Slowly, reluctantly, she began to participate. Not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't bear the guilt of doing nothing. It was manipulation of the cruelest kind, and she hated him for it, even as she acknowledged the terrible logic. One evening, after signing yet another stack of documents, Chioma threw the pen across the room in frustration. When does this end? When do I get to have a life again? Park Miho, who'd been standing by the door, picked up the pen and placed it back on the desk. When the covenant is fulfilled. When, she demanded, standing to face him. Give me a date. Give me something to hope for. He looked at her for a long moment. 4 months from now, there's a meeting. The heads of 6 families will gather to finalize the last of your father's outstanding agreements. You must be there. You must represent the Nwosu name and seal the contracts with your blood. Literally. Once that's done, the covenant is fulfilled, and you'll be free to go. Chioma's heart leaped at the word free. But then his words fully registered. My blood? What does that mean? It's an old tradition. A small cut on your palm, your blood pressed to the seal of each contract. It's symbolic, but in our world, symbols are everything. The other families need to see that you're real, that you're willing to honor your father's promises. If you refuse, or if something happens to you before that meeting, the covenant is void and everything falls apart. She sank back into her chair, her brief hope crashing. And if I do this? If I play my part in this barbaric ritual? Then you'll be given money, a new identity if you want one, and passage to anywhere in the world you choose. I'll have fulfilled my obligation to your father, and you'll have fulfilled yours. We'll never see each other again. The finality in his voice should have been comforting. Instead, Chioma felt a strange emptiness. For months suddenly seemed both impossibly far away and frighteningly close. What happens between now and then? She asked quietly. You survive, Park Miho said, moving toward the door. You learn what you need to know to play your part convincingly. And you pray that none of my enemies discover how valuable you truly are. The training began the next day. Park Miho assigned a woman named Mrs. Kim to teach Chioma everything she needed to know. Korean business etiquette, the proper ways to bow, how to address different ranks within the organization, and most importantly, how to recognize danger. Mrs. Kim was in her late 50s, elegant and sharp-eyed, and she treated Chioma with a mixture of sympathy and strict discipline. The meeting will be dangerous, Mrs. Kim told her during one session. These men are old-school traditionalists. They won't want to see a Nigerian woman holding power they believe should belong to a Korean man. You must be perfect, Chioma. One mistake, one sign of weakness, and they'll tear you apart. Chioma absorbed everything like a sponge, driven by the knowledge that her survival depended on it. She learned to read subtle body language that indicated respect or threat. She practiced the ceremonial phrases she would need to recite. She memorized the names and faces of the 6 family heads, learning their histories, their grudges, their alliances. At night, alone in her room, she would stand by the window looking out at the lights of Seoul in the distance, wondering if she would survive long enough to see the city as a free woman. The thought of freedom became her anchor, the only thing keeping her from drowning in despair. As the weeks passed, Chioma began to notice changes in Park Miho as well. He spent more time in her presence, sometimes sitting in silence while she studied, other times engaging her in conversations that had nothing to do with business. He asked about her life in Lagos, her childhood, her dreams before everything fell apart. She was wary at first, suspecting manipulation, but his interest seemed genuine. In turn, she found herself curious about him, about the man behind the cold mask. Why did you become this? She asked him one evening. Why choose this life? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. I didn't choose it. I inherited it, just as you inherited your burden. My father built this organization, and when he died, I was expected to take his place. I was 23 years old. I wanted to be a doctor, to save lives instead of controlling them. But duty isn't something you can walk away from in my world. Chioma felt an unexpected kinship with him. They were both prisoners of their father's choices, both carrying weights they'd never asked for. What was she like? Chioma asked softly. Hyojin. Park Miho's expression shuddered immediately, walls slamming back into place. That's not something I discuss. But at the door, he paused. She was everything good that I'm not. She made me believe I could be more than what my father created. When she died, that belief died with her. He left before Chioma could respond, but his words stayed with her long into the night. The weeks turned into months, and Chioma found herself caught in a strange paradox. She was counting down the days until freedom, but she was also becoming more enmeshed in this world with each passing day. She attended meetings with Park Miho, sitting silently as he negotiated deals and settled disputes. She saw the respect his men had for him, the fear his enemies held, and the crushing weight of responsibility he carried. She watched him make impossible choices, sacrificing his own desires for the organization's survival, and she began to understand why her father had trusted him with a covenant. Park Miho was brutal when necessary, but he was also fair, loyal, and utterly incapable of breaking his word. One night, unable to sleep, Chioma left her room and wandered the compound's halls. She hadn't tried to escape in weeks, partly because she knew it was futile, but mostly because she had nowhere to go. Her old life was gone, burned to ash by Juno's betrayal and her family's complicity. She found herself in a wing of the compound she'd never explored before, drawn by the sound of a cello. Following the music, she came to a room with the door slightly ajar. Inside, Park Miho sat with a cello between his knees, his eyes closed as his bow moved across the strings. The music was haunting and beautiful, filled with a longing that made her chest ache. She must have made a sound because he stopped playing immediately, his eyes snapping open. When he saw her, his expression cycled through surprise, irritation, and then resignation. You shouldn't be here, he said, but there was no real anger in his voice. Chioma stepped into the room. I didn't know you played. He looked down at the cello. It's the one thing I kept from before. Hyojin loved music. She used to sit exactly where you're standing and listen for hours. Play something for me, Chioma said softly. Please. He looked at her for a long moment, then positioned his bow and began to play again. This melody was different, less sorrowful and more hopeful, like dawn breaking after endless night. Chioma closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, feeling something inside her begin to thaw. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes to find him watching her. Thank you, she whispered. Park Miho stood abruptly, putting distance between them. You should go back to your room. The meeting is in 3 weeks. You need to be rested. But as she turned to leave, he spoke again. Chioma. She looked back. You've done well these past months. You're stronger than I expected. Your father would be proud. It was the first personal compliment he'd given her, and it hit harder than she'd anticipated. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and fled back to her room where she cried into her pillow, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't untangle. The final 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. The meeting would take place in a warehouse near the port, neutral territory belonging to none of the families. Chioma was given a traditional Korean hanbok to wear, black silk with silver embroidery, a symbol of mourning and the weight she carried. Mrs. Kim helped her dress the morning of the meeting, her hands gentle but her face grave. Be brave, child. And remember, no matter what happens, don't show fear. These men are predators. They can smell weakness. Park Miho came to collect her personally, flanked by 8 of his most trusted guards. He looked at her for a long moment. Are you ready? He asked. Chioma took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. I don't have a choice but to be ready. They drove through Seoul in a convoy of black vehicles, and Chioma watched the city pass by through tinted windows, wondering if this would be the last time she saw it. When they arrived at the warehouse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows. Inside, the space had been transformed. Long tables formed a hexagon, with chairs for the 6 family heads and their advisors. At the center was a single chair, isolated and exposed. That was where Chioma would sit. The other families began to arrive, and Chioma felt the weight of their stares. These were dangerous men with hard faces and calculating eyes. She could feel their contempt like a physical force. A woman, a foreigner, a black woman, sitting in a position of power in their world. It was an insult to everything they believed. Park Miho stayed close, a silent presence at her back, and she drew strength from his proximity. When everyone was seated, the eldest family head, a man named Lee Sang-min, stood and addressed the room. We are here to finalize the covenant made by Daniel Nwosu and to determine if his heir is worthy of the trust he placed in her. Chioma stood, her legs steady despite the fear coursing through her. I am Chioma Nwosu. I come to honor my father's word and to seal the agreements he made on behalf of both our families. Lee Sang-min smiled coldly. Words are easy, Miss Nwosu. We require proof. You will seal each contract with your blood, before all of us as witnesses. Only then will the covenant be fulfilled. A guard brought forward an ornate knife and 6 documents. Chioma's heart pounded as she realized what was about to happen. She would have to cut her own palm 6 times and press her bloody handprint to each seal. She looked back at Park Miho, seeking reassurance. He gave her a single small nod. You can do this. Chioma turned back to the table, picked up the knife, and before she could overthink it, drew the blade across her left palm. The pain was sharp and immediate, blood welling up and spilling over her fingers. She pressed her palm to the first document, leaving a bright red print. Then the second. The third. By the 4th, her vision was blurring. By the 6th, she was swaying on her feet. But she remained standing, refusing to show weakness. When it was done, Lee Sang-min examined each document carefully, then nodded. The covenant is sealed. Daniel Nwosu's debt is paid. But before Chioma could feel relief, the warehouse doors exploded inward. Men poured in, dozens of them, wearing the colors of a rival organization. Gunfire erupted, shattering the formal atmosphere. Chioma was thrown to the ground as Park Miho shielded her with his body, his gun already in his hand. The room descended into chaos. Bullets flying, men shouting, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. Someone had betrayed the meeting's location, turning what should have been sacred ground into a battlefield. Park Miho dragged Chioma behind an overturned table, his men forming a protective circle. Stay down, he ordered, returning fire with deadly precision. Chioma pressed her bleeding hand against her chest, her heart hammering. She could hear men dying around her, screams mixing with gunfire. This was the reality of the world she'd been forced into. The violence beneath every deal and every promise. Then, as suddenly as it started, it was over. The attackers retreated, leaving behind bodies and smoke. Park Miho checked Chioma for injuries, his hands surprisingly gentle. We need to leave.
Now.
This was a message. Someone doesn't want the covenant fulfilled. They fled the warehouse, leaving the surviving family heads to tend their wounded. The drive back to the compound was tense and silent, Chioma's mind reeling. She had sealed the covenant. She had survived. By all rights, she should be free now. But as they pulled through the compound gates, she realized that freedom was suddenly the last thing on her mind. In her room, a doctor stitched her palm while Chioma sat in numb shock. Park Miho stood by the window, his back rigid, his jaw clenched. When the doctor left, silence filled the space between them. Finally, Chioma spoke. The covenant is fulfilled. I did what I was supposed to do. Yes, he said without turning. So I can leave now. That was the agreement. Yes. Chioma stood, her bandaged hand throbbing. Then why do you look like you're attending a funeral? He turned then, and the expression on his face stopped her breath. It was raw, unguarded, filled with conflict she'd never seen him show before. "Because I am," he said quietly. "I'm watching you walk out of my life, and I've just realized I don't want you to go." The confession hung heavy in the air between them. Chioma's heart stuttered. "You don't mean that. You're just feeling responsible because of the covenant." Park Miho crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping so close she had to tilt her head back. "I stopped feeling responsible weeks ago, Chioma. What I feel now is something I swore I'd never feel again after Hyojin died. You've made me remember what it's like to want something beyond duty and revenge. You've made me feel human again, and I hate you for it even as I can't imagine letting you go." Chioma's breath caught. She should be angry. She should be running as far from this man and this world as possible. But instead, she found herself reaching up with her good hand to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw. "I should hate you," she whispered. "You took everything from me." His hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his cheek. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I'm asking you to stay. Not as a prisoner, not because of the covenant, but because I want you here. Because in these months, you've become the one thing in my life that makes sense." She looked into his eyes and saw the truth there, the vulnerability he was offering. And she felt something shift inside herself. The anger and grief that had sustained her began to crack, revealing something else underneath. Hope, maybe, or the possibility of it. "I don't know how to forgive you," she said honestly. "I don't know if I ever can. But I also don't know how to leave." Park Miho leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "Then don't. Stay. Let me spend however long it takes earning your forgiveness. Let me show you there's more to this life than darkness." Chioma closed her eyes too, feeling his warmth, the solid reality of his presence. It was insane. Impossible. She should be planning her escape, not standing here considering a future with the man who destroyed her old life. But maybe her old life had needed to be destroyed. Maybe the naive girl at that altar was never meant to survive the real world. Maybe she needed to be broken down and rebuilt into someone stronger, someone who could stand beside a man like Park Miho without flinching from the darkness. "I need time," she finally said, pulling back to look at him. "I need to figure out who I am now, separate from the covenant, separate from what my father made me." He nodded slowly. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." And so a new chapter began, one without contracts or blood oaths, but filled with its own uncertainties. Chioma didn't leave the compound, but she stopped being a prisoner. She started exploring Seoul, always with guards for protection, but with freedom to go where she pleased. She enrolled in business classes at a university, determined to understand this world on her own terms. She started writing again, something she'd loved before everything fell apart, filling notebooks with her thoughts, slowly processing the trauma. Park Miho gave her space, but never disappeared entirely. He would leave books on her desk that he thought she'd enjoy. He would join her for dinner occasionally, their conversations slowly moving from awkward to something approaching comfortable. He never pushed, never demanded, just waited with patience she hadn't known he possessed. Slowly, cautiously, Chioma began to let her guard down. She started asking questions about the organization, about the decisions he made, and why. She began to see the impossible position he occupied, the weight of responsibility that never lifted. 8 months after the warehouse meeting, Chioma opened a small cafe in Itaewon, Seoul's international district. It served Nigerian food, the flavors of her childhood, and it became a haven for the Nigerian community in Korea. It was her declaration of independence, proof she could build something of her own. Park Miho came to the opening, sitting quietly in a corner. When she brought him a plate of jollof rice and egusi soup, he ate every bite and told her it was the best meal he'd ever had. She knew he was lying, but the gesture touched her anyway. One evening, as she was closing up, Park Miho appeared at the door looking nervous, an expression she'd never seen on him. "I need to show you something," he said. "Will you come with me?" Curious, Chioma agreed. They drove to a building in Gangnam, and when they went inside, she realized it was an apartment. Beautifully furnished, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River. "What is this?" she asked. Park Miho put a key in her hand. "It's yours. I bought it for you. I know you've been staying at the compound out of convenience, but I wanted you to have a place that's completely your own. No strings attached. You can live here, sell it, or burn it down if you want. It's yours." Chioma stood in the middle of the living room, overwhelmed. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had ever done for her. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. He moved to the window. "Because you deserve something beautiful that's untouched by the ugliness of my world. Because I want you to know I see you, Chioma. Not as a covenant or a responsibility, but as a woman who's survived things that would have broken most people. You're extraordinary, and I wanted to give you something that reflected that." She walked over to him, her heart pounding. "Park Miho." He turned to face her, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "I forgive you," she said. "I don't know exactly when it happened. Probably somewhere between the cello music and the jollof rice. But I forgive you. And more than that, I think I'm falling in love with you, which is absolutely insane considering how we met." His expression transformed, the stoic mask falling away completely to reveal raw joy. "Chioma," he breathed, reaching for her. She stepped into his arms, and when he kissed her, it was like coming home and leaping off a cliff simultaneously. It was terrifying and exhilarating and perfect. All the months of tension, all the careful distance, dissolved in that moment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Chioma laughed. A real, genuine laugh from somewhere deep inside. "What's funny?" Park Miho asked, his forehead against hers. "Everything. All of this. The fact that I'm standing here in love with the man who kidnapped me from my wedding. The fact that the worst day of my life led to this moment. It's absurd." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Absurd, but real. I love you, Chioma Nwosu. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserve your love in return." And he did. Their relationship wasn't easy. There were days when Chioma's trauma resurfaced, when she couldn't stand to be touched, when nightmares plagued her sleep. There were days when Park Miho's world intruded, when his responsibilities pulled him away for days at a time, when danger threatened them both. But through it all, they held onto each other, building something real and lasting from the ashes of their broken pasts. Chioma's cafe thrived, becoming a gathering place not just for Nigerians, but for anyone seeking authentic food and genuine warmth. Park Miho slowly began stepping back from the more violent aspects of his organization, using his power to shift toward legitimate businesses. It was a slow transformation, one that would take years, but Chioma was his compass, guiding him toward the man he'd wanted to be before duty claimed him. They were both works in progress, both scarred by their father's choices, but together they were building something new, something hopeful. On the anniversary of the day they met, Park Miho took Chioma back to the church where she'd been taken. It had been closed for renovation, but he'd arranged for them to go inside. "Why are we here?" Chioma asked, her voice echoing in the empty space. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the scar on her palm from the covenant sealing. "Because this is where your old life ended. And I wanted to give you a chance to say goodbye to who you were before. You're not that frightened bride anymore, Chioma. You're someone so much stronger, so much more incredible. I wanted you to see that." She looked around the church, remembering the terror and betrayal she'd felt that day. But the memories had less power now. They were part of her story, but they no longer defined her. "You're right," she said softly. "I'm not that person anymore. She died here, and someone new was born." She turned to face him. Someone who isn't afraid of the darkness, because she's learned to carry her own light. Park Miho pulled her close, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, in that place where her nightmare had begun, Chioma felt truly free for the first time since everything fell apart. She had survived. She had forgiven. She had found love in the most impossible place. And her future, Once stolen and then gradually reclaimed, now stretched out before her full of endless possibility. 2 years later, Chioma stood in that same church, but this time, everything was different. The pews were filled with people who genuinely loved her. Her mother sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of joy and pride. They had reconciled slowly, painfully, but Chioma had eventually found it in her heart to understand that her mother had been terrified and powerless that day, not complicit. Park Miho stood at the altar in a tailored suit, his eyes locked on her as she walked down the aisle. This time, there were no armed men, no threats, no coercion. Just two people who had found each other in the darkness and chose to walk toward the light together. When they exchanged vows, Chioma's voice was strong and clear. She was no longer the woman who had been dragged screaming from this place. She was someone new. Someone forged in fire and blood and pain. Someone who had learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead us to exactly where we need to be. "I never thought I'd stand here again," she whispered to Park Miho as they held hands. "I never thought I'd want to." "Neither did I," he whispered back. "But I'm grateful every day that fate brought you crashing into my life, even if it wasn't in the way either of us would have chosen." The priest asked if anyone objected to the union. The silence was complete and peaceful. When Park Miho kissed his bride, it was nothing like the cold, transactional arrangement that had brought them together. It was a promise, a beginning, a choice they were both making freely. At the reception, held in the garden of their shared home, Chioma gave a toast that left not a single dry eye in the crowd. "Someone once told me that I was the only thing standing between peace and chaos," she said, raising her glass. "And for a long time, I resented that burden. I hated being defined by my father's choices, by a covenant I never agreed to. But I've learned that sometimes our greatest burdens become our greatest gifts. The path I was forced to walk led me to understand strength I never knew I had. It led me to build a community, a home, and a love that I would never have found if everything had gone according to my original plan." She looked at Park Miho, who was watching her with undisguised adoration. "So, to anyone here who feels trapped by circumstances beyond their control, who feels like their story has been written by someone else, I want you to know this. You can rewrite it. It won't be easy. It will be painful and terrifying, and you'll want to give up 1,000 times. But you're not defined by what happens to you. You're defined by what you do with it." The crowd erupted in applause, and Park Miho pulled her into his arms, whispering in her ear, "Have I mentioned today that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known?" "Only 3 times, she teased, wiping tears from her eyes. "But I'll never get tired of hearing it." 3 years after that, Chioma sat in her cafe nursing a cup of Nigerian tea, one hand resting on her very pregnant belly. The cafe had expanded to 3 locations across Seoul, each one employing Nigerian immigrants and serving as a community center. She'd also started a foundation that helped African women in Korea start their own businesses, providing microloans and mentorship. Park Miho had successfully transitioned most of the family business into legitimate enterprises, real estate development, technology investments, and import-export companies that operated completely above board. He still maintained connections to his old world. That kind of past never completely disappears, but he no longer lived in it. Mrs. Kim walked into the cafe, now retired but still a frequent visitor and beloved friend. She sat down across from Chioma with a knowing smile. "You're thinking about that day again, aren't you?" Mrs. Kim asked. "The wedding that wasn't." Chioma nodded, sipping her tea. "I think about it less now, but yes. Especially now." She patted her belly. "I keep thinking about how different my life would have been if none of it had happened. If Juno had actually married me." "Would you change it?" Mrs. Kim asked quietly. "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you change it?" Chioma was quiet for a long moment, really considering the question. 5 years ago, the answer would have been an immediate, screaming yes. Even 2 years ago, she might have hesitated but ultimately said yes. But now? "No," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I wouldn't change it. Not because what happened was right or good, it wasn't. It was traumatic and painful, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But it made me who I am. It led me to Miho, to this cafe, to this community, to this life. And I love who I am now. I love the life I've built. So no, I wouldn't change it. Mrs. Kim reached across the table and squeezed her hand. That's how I know you've truly healed. When you can look at your scars and see them as part of your story, not the whole story. That evening, as Chioma and Park Miho lay in bed, his hand resting gently on her belly feeling their daughter kick, she told him about the conversation. Do you ever regret it? She asked him. Keeping the covenant? Taking me that day? Park Miho was quiet, his fingers tracing gentle circles on her stomach. I regret the pain it caused you. I regret that we couldn't have found each other a different way. But regret you? Regret us? Never. You saved my life, Chioma. Not the other way around. I was already dead when you came into my world. I was just going through the motions, honoring obligations, carrying out duties. You reminded me what it felt like to be alive. We saved each other, Chioma corrected softly. That's the truth of it. Their daughter was born on a rainy spring morning, and they named her Hyojin, after Park Miho's first wife. It had been Chioma's idea, and it had taken her weeks to convince him. She was part of your story, Chioma had argued. And our story is built on both of our pasts, not in spite of them. Our daughter should carry both our histories forward. When Park Miho held his newborn daughter for the first time, tears streaming down his face, he looked at Chioma with such profound love and gratitude that she felt her own tears start. Thank you, he whispered. For everything. For surviving. For forgiving. For choosing to stay. For giving me a future I never thought I'd have. Thank you for waiting, Chioma replied. For being patient. For loving me even when I couldn't love you back. For becoming the man I needed you to be. As Chioma watched her husband cradle their daughter, humming a soft melody, she thought about the terrified bride who had been dragged screaming from a church 5 years ago. That girl would never have believed this moment was possible. That girl would have seen only the nightmare, not the possibility hidden within it. But that girl had died that day, and someone stronger had emerged from the ashes. Someone who had learned that strength isn't about never falling apart. It's about putting yourself back together in a new shape. Someone who had discovered that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the past poison your future. Someone who had proven that love can bloom even in the darkest soil, maybe especially in the darkest soil, because that's where you learn its true value. The covenant that had bound her had also freed her in ways she never could have imagined. It had torn her life apart, yes, but in doing so, it had allowed her to rebuild something better, something stronger, something entirely her own. Years later, when people asked Chioma about her unusual love story, she would smile and say, I married a monster who taught me I was a monster too, but the kind that protects instead of destroys. The kind that builds instead of tears down. We were both broken by our father's sins, but we chose to heal each other. And that choice, made every single day, is what makes us human. And when young women came to her foundation, trapped in situations they didn't choose, bound by circumstances beyond their control, she would tell them her story. Not to glorify what happened to her, but to show them that survival is possible. That healing is possible. That reclaiming your narrative is possible. You are not your trauma, she would tell them. You are not the worst thing that ever happened to you. You are what you do next. You are the choices you make from this moment forward. And yes, some of those choices will be hard. Some will feel impossible. But they're yours. And that's where your power lives. The cafe continued to grow. The foundation flourished. Little Hyojin grew into a fierce, bright child who spoke 3 languages and had her father's intensity and her mother's compassion. Park Miho's hair started showing gray at the temples, which Chioma insisted made him look distinguished. They bought a house by the sea where they spent weekends teaching their daughter to swim and building sandcastles. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they returned once more to the church where everything had changed. But this time, they brought their daughter, who ran down the aisle giggling while her parents watched with joy. She's free in a way we never were, Park Miho observed, watching Hyojin spin in circles, her arms outstretched. No covenants. No blood oaths. Just possibility. That's what we gave her, Chioma said, slipping her hand into his. That's what we gave each other. Freedom from the chains our fathers forged. It took us longer to find it, but we got there. We got there, he agreed, pulling her close. And as they stood in that church, in the exact spot where Chioma's old life had ended and her new life had begun, they weren't thinking about the past anymore. They were thinking about the future. About the cafe opening in Busan next month. About Hyojin starting school in the fall. About the quiet, beautiful, ordinary life they'd built together from extraordinary circumstances. They had taken the worst thing that ever happened to them and transformed it into the best thing. Not because it was easy, not because it was fair, but because they chose, every single day, to write a different ending than the one fate had planned. And that, Chioma thought as they walked out of the church hand in hand with their daughter skipping between them, was the real miracle. Not that they'd survived, but that they'd thrived. That they'd taken broken pieces and forged them into something whole and beautiful and theirs. The covenant was fulfilled years ago, but the love they'd built in its wake would last forever. If this story of transformation, forgiveness, and unexpected love moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove redemption is always possible. Drop a comment below telling us, could you forgive someone who hurt you if they genuinely changed? Have you ever found something beautiful in the worst situation of your life? Share your story with us. And don't forget to check out our other videos about love, survival, and the strength of the human spirit. See you in the next one.